Hi, Joe Stowell here, and welcome to Daily Strength. I'm just wondering if today we can get the real God to stand up. Let's talk. For all of us who think that God is the hammer guy of the Old Testament, well, think again. I'm just a little put out by the prevailing thought that God was brutal and ugly in the Old Testament, and that thankfully Jesus arrived on the scene in the New Testament to rescue his reputation. Getting this straight, by the way, is a big deal. It's really hard to love and follow a God who is ruthless with his power and abusive in his relationships. It's bad enough that some of us have had dads like that, let alone a Father in heaven who perpetuates the problem. So, here's the good news. Take a deep breath. You don't need to feel that way about God anymore. When the real God stands up in the Old Testament, his actions and attitudes consistently exhibit an unusual depth of grace in the face of deep offenses against him and his law. Take the sin of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. Hey, talk about a time when it would have been really appropriate for God to pull the hammer out. God had given them everything they needed for life and satisfaction in a perfect environment. They blatantly conspired with God's enemy and used God's gift of the garden to serve their own selfish desires, and in the process destroyed the gift of God as sin destroyed the garden and their lives, to say nothing of granting Satan access to the domain of God, where he would continue his damaging ways right up until today. If one of our kids had taken all that we had built up and all that we had given to them and in our face destroyed it all, well, my guess is that grace would be the last response to cross our minds. Annihilation? Yeah. Grace? Probably not. But get a grip on this. Of those two options, God chose grace. The grace to walk back into the fallen, damaged garden and call them out of the bushes, not to hammer them, but to restore them. The grace to replace the self-constructed fig leaf cover-up of their sins with the sacrificial provision of the animal skins, pointing to the ultimate moment of grace when the sacrifice of Jesus would cover us with the permanent covering of the righteousness of Christ. The grace to expel them from the garden, so that they would not eat of the tree of life and live forever in the bondage and brokenness of sin. Hey, he had something better in mind for them, heaven, where they could live forever, liberated from the consequences of their own foolishness. And then there was the remarkable stroke of grace to Cain, who in a fit of jealous rage murdered his brother. After refusing to accept God's gracious offer of restoration, God marked him so that others would not kill him, and then upped the punishment by sevenfold against anyone who would ignore the mark and kill Cain. And then there was the grace to establish a godly line in a deeply damaged world by the birth of Seth, who started the legacy of those who would live by calling on the name of the Lord. Getting to know the real God is a wonderful experience, especially if we are getting to know him as a God of unusual grace. Why? Because we all deserve the hammer, that's why. But God manages our brokenness with the healing and restoring power of his grace. So rejoice with me in the words of the old hymn, "Marvelous grace of our loving Lord, grace that exceeds my sin and my guilt. Yonder on Calvary's mount outpoured," the hymn says, "there where the blood of the Lamb was spilt."
Will part